Hi, and welcome back to Kohelet. Kohelet had just finished discussing how everything that we do in life and our entire focus is always upon reaching and attaining and desire and getting to places and having goals, and how a lot of that is wrapped up in absurdity. And Kohelet had continually been focusing on this theme of absurdity and meaninglessness, but there's one aspect of the absurdity of life that Kohelet had not yet touched upon. And that is the unfairness and the injustice of evil. And that's what Kohelet tackles next. And Kohelet continues, V'od ra'isi tachas hashamesh, Mekom hamishpat shama haresha, U'mekom hatzedek shama harasha. And there's more I saw under the sun. The place of justice, there is evil. And the place of righteousness, there is evil. Remember, under the sun is a metaphor for the things that happen in this world, in this material world, that often make no sense and that are often absurd. And that's what Kohelet uses this theme for throughout, starting at the beginning of Kohelet. And so under the sun, we see this aspect that in the place of justice, in the court system, where justice is dispensed, even in the most just and righteous place, even there often lurks injustice. Often even the face of someone who's just or righteous is just covering up for injustice and evil and lack of righteousness. And there's something that's very unjust and unfair and absurd in that even the place of the most justice is often the most unjust. But there's something a lot deeper here and more fundamental. You need evil in order for justice to exist. Justice is the setting straight and the setting right of those two poles of evil and good, right? In order to balance, justice is always symbolized by a balance scale. You need to balance out good and evil, and justice does that. But justice cannot exist without evil. Justice sits on the place of evil, and evil must exist in order for the fundamental pillar of fairness and justice to exist. And so in this absurd way, the place of justice actually is evil. And how can that be fair? How can that make sense? How can that be right? Because justice, the most right of things, is based on something that's wrong and unjust in the most fundamental way. And Kohelet continues, Amarti ani belibi, es hatzadik ve'es harasha yishpot ha'elohim, ki eis l'chol chefetz, v'al kol ha'maaseh sham. I said to myself in my heart, both the righteous and the evil, the God will judge. For there is a time for everything, for every striving, and for all that's done there. Our internal heart and sense of justice forces us to perceive and to feel that there's a place from which a greater justice will be brought to bear, and that there is a place from which everything will ultimately be justified and will make sense. Notice how he uses ki eis l'chal chefetz. There's a time for every striving, which is the exact same phrase and wording that he used in the poem About Time, where he talked about how everything is right in its time, every striving has its place, and in its own place it makes sense, but in the greater picture often it doesn't, and often it's absurd. And here he's using it actually almost for exactly the opposite in a deeper sense, that there is a place from which every striving and everything must make sense. Ki eis l'chal chefetz, you can translate it a number of different ways. You can translate it that there is a place for every striving, and therefore there's good striving and bad striving, and the good and the evil ultimately need to be justified. You can also translate it that there is a place for every striving and for everything that's done, and that ultimately there is a place in which it will be justified. But there's even a more fundamental sense, ki eis l'chal chefetz. There is a sense in which everything is assigned its time and place, and just like in the poem About Time, those things that were right in their place ultimately were absurd in the bigger picture. Here too, things that are, but the opposite, the converse, here too, the things that are unjust in their own time, we have a feeling and we have this greater picture of justice, and we feel that ultimately in the bigger picture all of those things must to us become justified. Amarti ani velibi al divras b'nei ha'adam levaram ha'elohim veliros shehem behema hema lohem. So this is a very difficult verse to accurately translate. There's a lot of different ways to translate parts and words and portions of the verse. Al divras b'nei ha'adam can be on account of people, on the speaking of people, on the things that people speak. In other words, he's responding to certain things that people speak. It can be on the management of people. Levaram ha'elohim can mean, the word levaram can mean to sift them, to purify, to create, to choose. Veliros shehem behema hema lahem is a very difficult phrase. It's a poetic phrase that doesn't quite work in the actual literal order of the words. You kind of have to pick it apart and parse it and put it back together in various different poetic ways so that it makes grammatic sense. But basically what he's saying in this verse is, I said to myself, this is on account of people, so as to sift them and to show them that they are from a certain perspective, but like animals to themselves, meaning to each person, to their own self and to each other. That is, this division of the world into good and evil, and this ability to act with goodness and to act with evil, sifts people, and it divides people, and it divides people internally and externally into a situation where they can be either good or evil. They can act well or they can act badly. It sifts them into good and less good versions of themselves. And it allows them to see from a certain perspective that they are to themselves, but as animals. That from a certain perspective, in other words, of course, from the human perspective, they can look back and see that certain parts of them and a certain perspective of them is actually just like an animal. Ki mikra b'nei ha'adam u'mikra ha'behema u'mikra echad lahem. Kemos zeh kein mos zeh v'ruach echad lakol. Imosar ha'adam and ha'behema ayin ki hakol havel. For happenstance are humans, and happenstance are animals, and one happenstance to them both. Like this one, so dies this one, and one direction to all. And the excess of humans over animals is nothing, for all together is meaningless. So this again is an extremely rich verse, and it has a lot in it. But to summarize, we'll say the following, that the thinking human, the human being that perceives, is able to look back upon themselves and to see that from a certain perspective, they are but as animals. What happens to one happens to the other. They're both victims of happenstance. They're both placed in this world of happenstance. They move in similar directions, and they have similar drives. The human has very similar drives to the animal, and they both die at the end. And from this vantage point, the advantage of humans over animals is nothing, because all is meaningless. Hakol holech el makom echad. Hakol hayam min ha'afar, v'hakol shav el ha'afar. All goes to one place. All was from the earth, and all returns to the earth. Mi yodea ruach b'nei ha'adam ha'ola hi lemala, v'ruach ha'behema ha'yoredes hi lemata la'aretz. Who knows the spirit and direction of humans, that it goes upward above, and the animal spirit, that it goes down to the bottom to ground? Can one really know the difference in the qualia and the intrinsic essences of humans and animals to assign them different directions? Can one fully grasp the essence of humans in the sense that they're raised up, and the essence of animals in the sense that they are more lowly? Can one truly, really, fully grasp and understand that? And finally, back to square one. V'ra'isi ki ein tov ma'asher yismach ha'adam b'masav ki hu chalko, ki mi yivieno liros b'meshayia acharav. And I realized that ultimately there is no good but to rejoice in one's deeds and to be happy with one's actions. For that is his portion, for what can bring him to see what will be after him. And so ultimately, all that we really have are our deeds and our happiness in this moment. And that's a theme that Kohelet had already mentioned in different ways at other times. Now, since this lecture was a little more meandering than usual, I'm going to wrap it all up and tie it together by choosing one reading through all of these verses and one path among all the many different ways that there are to read them, and read it all in one continuous reading. So Kohelet had said God desires the chase. God desires for people to constantly be chasing things and be experiencing desire and want and need and always looking to fulfill themselves. And Kohelet said, but I saw related to the theme of chase and desire and need and loss is the existence of evil, an intrinsic ability in creation to permit evil. The fact that we are always seeking and that there's always something missing is tied to the existence of a person's ability to do good and evil. If everything is right only to its time, then by definition there can also be things that are wrong to their time. And the place of justice, there is evil. And the place of righteousness, there is evil. And so I said in my heart, the desire for the judgment of good and evil I must leave to God. For everything has a time and place. For there is a time for every desire, and the desire to always find justice in everything can't always be satisfied. And over every action, everything that's done, I must find its reason and logic in the action itself. And I said it's set up this way, permitting desire, trouble, and evil, on account of the sting of mankind, to purify people, to sift and to test them, to separate them and to make them be better, and to make them see and understand that in a certain perspective, they are but like animals, as animals to themselves and to each other. But nature and happenstance happens to people. And nature and happenstance happens to animals. The same experience to both. Like one, so dies the other. And the surfeit of man is nothing, if all is meaningless. Everything goes the same way. All goes to one place. All was from the earth, and all returns to the earth. And who really gets to experience the spirit of man as raised up and different from that of animals? And who can truly comprehend the subtleties of and the differences between the spirit of humans in the sense that they are raised up and those of animals that are lower, more earthy? And who can really know how and to what extent that operates? And so I saw that there really is no good but to bring about one's satisfaction and happiness through one's own deeds. For that is man's only certain part. For how can he ever really understand anything beyond him? It's tough, there's evil and unfairness, but really what can you do? Only use your deeds to bring yourself goodness and joy, and then to rejoice in those deeds. Civilization and humanity and intelligence is incredibly precious, but the line between it and its opposite is incredibly thin, and takes great judgment and discernment. And so we need to do our utmost to treasure it and guard it. Conflict, suffering, and adversity sharpen the distinction and bring it to the fore and make us more clearly able to recognize and feel it. So what happens in an oddly absurd and paradoxical way is that the existence of evil that allows people to hurt one another and to cause a lack of good to exist in the world, ultimately, once that perpetuates itself and gets strengthened, that itself operates in such a way to make people turn back and become more good. Because those actions that are considered good, what they are in essence are a set of actions and ideas that cause people to live better. And although sometimes people forget them, but the results of those actions and what people feel as a result of those actions ultimately reminds them to treasure good and fairness and justice, and ultimately brings them back to that path. Thank you for listening. Kohelet is not over yet. There's more to come. If you like what you heard, click like, click subscribe, and we'll be back with more of Kohelet.